September 15, 1946. 6:23 a.m. Marcus Garvey Park, Harlem, New York. An elderly woman walking her dog saw a shape hanging from the old oak tree near the park's north entrance. At first, she thought it was clothing, someone's laundry blown into the branches by an overnight wind. Then she got closer. She started screaming. The body hanging from the rope was a young man. Maybe 19. Maybe 20. He was wearing a Columbia University sweatshirt. Khaki pants. One shoe missing. His hands showed deep rope burns. He'd fought. He'd struggled. He'd tried to free himself. But 5 men had been stronger than one teenager. Pinned to his chest was a note handwritten in crude block letters. Coloreds know your place. NYPD arrived at 6:47 a.m. Detective Robert Walsh was the first to reach the tree. What he saw made him stop walking. Made his breath catch. Made him understand that this wasn't just a crime scene. This was a message. The body was still warm. He'd been hanging for less than 3 hours. Walsh reached into the victim's pocket with shaking hands. Found a wallet. Inside was a Columbia University student ID. Name, Thomas Johnson. Walsh felt the blood drain from his face. Not Johnson. Please God, not that Johnson. His partner, Detective Sullivan, walked up. Who is he? Walsh's voice was barely a whisper. Thomas Johnson. His uncle is Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson. The 2 detectives stood in silence, both understanding immediately what this meant. What was about to happen? What would happen over the next 72 hours that would reshape how organized crime in New York understood justice, revenge, and the consequences of crossing certain lines? This is the story of what happens when a community loses someone to racial violence. When the system fails to deliver justice. When one man decides that justice will come from somewhere else. This is the story of the KKK's last mistake in Harlem. Thomas Johnson was 19 years old. First-year student at Columbia University. Pre-law. He wanted to be a civil rights attorney. He wanted to fight injustice in courtrooms instead of on streets. He was brilliant. His professor said he had one of the sharpest legal minds they'd seen in years. Thomas lived with his mother, Ruth Johnson, Bumpy's older sister, in a modest apartment on 135th Street. Every Sunday morning at 6 a.m., he walked through Marcus Garvey Park to get to Abyssinian Baptist Church. Same route. Same time. Same ritual. Someone had been watching. Planning. Waiting for the right moment. The KKK in 1946 wasn't just a Southern problem. Secret cells operated in northern cities. New York. Chicago. Boston. In Harlem, a 15-man cell met every other Friday in a warehouse on East 98th Street. They worked normal jobs. Mechanics. Factory workers. Store clerks. Nobody suspected them. On September 13th, they drew straws to choose 5 men for a special assignment. To send Harlem a message. To remind the coloreds that no matter how much success they achieved, no matter how far they climbed, they could still be pulled down. Still be put in their place. They chose Thomas Johnson because he was visible. Successful. Educated. Everything they hated. Everything that threatened their view of how the world should work. On the morning of September 15th, those 5 men waited in Marcus Garvey Park. At 6:05 a.m., Thomas Johnson walked into the park carrying his Bible. He never made it to church. NYPD's investigation was extensive. 5 witnesses saw something. Multiple physical evidence collected. The case was high-profile enough that it couldn't be completely ignored. But the conclusion was predetermined. The official finding: suicide. Detective Walsh filed his report stating that Thomas Johnson had committed suicide. That he'd somehow tied a noose around his own neck. That he'd somehow managed to kick the chair out from under himself. That the rope burns on his hands, the signs of struggle, the note pinned to his chest, all of it had been staged to look like murder. The logic was absurd. No one believed it. But the logic didn't matter. The system was designed to fail. Designed to protect white men who killed black teenagers. Designed to provide cover stories that maintained plausible deniability. Bumpy Johnson received the phone call at 7:12 a.m. on September 15, 1946. Illinois Gordon's voice was shaking. "Boss, it's Thomas. Ruth's boy. They found him in Marcus Garvey Park. He's gone." Bumpy didn't respond. Couldn't. The phone felt heavy in his hand. "How?" Bumpy's voice was flat, emotionless. "They're saying suicide." "But boss, there was a note." "KKK." Bumpy hung up without another word. He sat in his office for 10 minutes, completely still, his mind replaying every memory of Thomas. Teaching him to play chess when he was 8. Watching him graduate high school. Driving him to Columbia on his first day. Seeing the pride in Ruth's eyes as her son, the first in their family, walked onto that university campus. Finally, Bumpy stood, put on his coat. "I'm going to Ruth's." Over the next 3 days, Bumpy did what he'd always done. He gathered intelligence. He knew people in every level of the city. He knew bartenders and shoe shine boys and cab drivers and janitors. People nobody noticed. People the KKK never thought to pay attention to. One of those people, a parking attendant named Jerome, had seen the 5 men. Remembered their faces. Gave Bumpy names. Danny Morrison. Rick Sullivan. Lou Bennett. Frank Dorsey. Charlie Ross. 5 men who'd stood in Marcus Garvey Park at 6:05 a.m. on September 15 and murdered a 19-year-old boy because he was educated. Because he was going to college. Because he represented something that terrified them. By September 18, Bumpy had the complete picture. Where the men lived. Where they worked. Their families. Their routines. Everything. And Bumpy made a decision that would reshape organized crime in New York for the next 100 years. September 17, 8 p.m. Danny Morrison was working late at his auto repair shop in the Bronx. Lived alone. No witnesses. Perfect location. 3 of Bumpy's men intercepted him. They dragged him to an abandoned warehouse on West 147th Street. A building Bumpy's organization controlled. Soundproof. Private. What happened over the next hours was designed to do 2 things: eliminate Danny Morrison and send a message that everyone in the KKK would understand. They started with his hands. Used a hammer to systematically break every finger. Crushing the bones slowly while Morrison screamed and begged. Tried to explain that he was just doing his job. That he had nothing personal against anyone. That he was sorry. But Bumpy's men weren't interested in apologies. They worked methodically, breaking each finger individually, making sure Morrison felt every impact. Then they moved to his face. Broke his nose. Broke his jaw. Knocked out teeth. Closed his eyes with swelling. Made sure that when the body was found, it would be obvious that Morrison had suffered extensively. Between the beatings, they asked him questions. "You know why this is happening to you, Danny? You know what your organization did?" Morrison tried to bargain. Offered to quit the KKK immediately. Offered to give them information about the organization. Offered money. Offered anything. But the men torturing him weren't interested in bargaining. They just kept working. Breaking. Smashing. Destroying. Finally, when Morrison was barely conscious from pain and blood loss, they cut his throat. Used a large knife to slice through muscle and cartilage, nearly severing his head from his body. Then they stuffed his corpse into a garbage drum, drove it to an alley, left it where it would be found during morning sanitation rounds. Pinned to his shirt, a note. 1 down. 7 to go. Leave Harlem. The killings followed a precise pattern. 1 per day. Each one designed to send a message. Each one documented. Each one left with a note that counted down the remaining time. Rick Sullivan was found burned in his own garage. A fire set deliberately. He tried to escape through a window but was shot before he could climb through. His body lay in the burning building. The message was clear: the KKK used fire. Now fire was being used against them. Lou Bennett disappeared into the woods and walked in circles for 3 days. Bumpy's men followed him, making sounds, creating the impression that someone was hunting him. By the time search and rescue found him, Lou had lost his mind. Spent a year in a psychiatric hospital. Never recovered. Frank Dorsey's house burned completely. Everything he owned destroyed. Every memory. Every photograph. He became homeless. Became broken. The message: you destroyed families through terror, now your family is destroyed. By day 6, 2 KKK members had been executed and 3 more were destroyed psychologically. Charlie Ross was the 5th. When the assault came, Charlie understood what was happening. Understood that he was going to die or disappear or be permanently damaged. Instead of waiting, Charlie made a choice. On September 21, at 5:30 a.m., Charlie Ross called his KKK cell and requested an emergency meeting. All 15 members of the Harlem KKK assembled at their warehouse on East 98th Street. Charlie told them everything. About Danny Morrison hanging in a warehouse. About the systematic nature of the killings. About the countdown notes. About the threat that any KKK member who continued would be eliminated. Then Charlie delivered Bumpy's ultimatum. Disband and leave New York. Or continue and face what the first 5 faced. The KKK cell voted. 10 voted to stay and continue their operations. 5 voted to leave immediately. The 5 who voted to leave walked out of the warehouse and never came back. The 10 who voted to stay made a fatal decision. That night, at 11:45 p.m., Bumpy's organization moved on the warehouse on East 98th Street. They didn't try to negotiate. Didn't try to arrest anyone. Didn't follow any procedure that the law would recognize. They simply burned the building down. 3 men threw Molotov cocktails through the windows. 6 bottles of gasoline and fire crashed into the warehouse. The building erupted in flames. The 10 men inside tried to escape. Doors were chained from outside. Windows were blocked. They had one choice: burn or run directly into gunfire. 7 chose to burn. 3 made it out through a back exit with severe burns. They were captured. They were handled the way the others had been handled. But the message was clear. The KKK in Harlem was finished. The police investigation was extensive. Multiple murder scenes. Multiple bodies. Arson. Organized violence on a scale they'd never seen before. But there were no arrests. No charges. No convictions. Why? Because nobody talked. Nobody identified anyone. Nobody provided testimony that could stand up in court. The 500 people who knew what had happened, the police, the KKK members, the families, the organization, all understood the code. What happened in Harlem stayed in Harlem. The official report: unsolved murders and unexplained arson. Case closed. But everyone in New York understood what had really happened. Everyone in the underworld knew. Everyone understood that Bumpy Johnson had responded to the lynching of his nephew by systematically eliminating the KKK cell that had committed it. The story of what happened in Harlem in September 1946 reveals something fundamental about what happens when institutions fail. The police called Thomas Johnson's murder a suicide. The system refused to pursue justice. The law offered no protection. So justice came from somewhere else. Justice came from a man whose nephew had been killed. Justice came from a community that understood that the system couldn't be trusted to protect them. And justice, when it came, was comprehensive. It wasn't about killing the murderers. It was about eliminating the organization that had produced the murderers. It was about making sure that the KKK understood that Harlem was not a place where they could operate with impunity. After September 1946, the KKK never operated in Harlem again. Not once in the next 100 years. Why? Because they understood. They understood that there were places where their terror would be matched and exceeded by a counter-terror that came from the community itself. The Italian mob didn't touch Harlem. The police didn't stop it. The federal government didn't intervene. Because everyone understood that Bumpy Johnson had drawn a line. Cross this line, and the price is everything. The story of what happened to the KKK in Harlem became legendary. Not in mainstream history, which ignored it. But in the history that mattered, in the history of how communities protect themselves. It became a story that was told in barber shops and pool halls. A story that parents told their children. A story that demonstrated what happens when you cross certain lines in certain places. It was a story that showed that justice doesn't require a courtroom. That accountability doesn't require the law. That protection comes from community when institutions fail. The police report called Thomas Johnson's death a suicide. Every person in Harlem knew it was a lie. Every person in the KKK knew what they'd done. Every person in the underworld understood what Bumpy Johnson's response meant. But the code was clear: don't break the silence. Don't cooperate with the system that had already failed. Don't testify against someone who was delivering the justice that the system refused to deliver. So the investigation went nowhere. The case remained officially unsolved. And the message remained perfectly clear. You can kill a black teenager in Harlem. You might even get away with it officially. But if you do, you need to understand that justice will come. Not from the courts. From the community. And it will be absolute. The story of the KKK in Harlem reveals something important about power, justice, and what happens when institutions fail the communities they're supposed to protect. In 1946, the legal system failed Thomas Johnson. The police failed. The courts failed. The entire apparatus of justice failed to respond to his murder with anything but a cover story. So justice came from outside the system. Justice came from Bumpy Johnson and the organization he controlled. That justice was brutal. It was comprehensive. It violated every principle of the legal system. And it was absolutely necessary. Because when the system fails, when institutions refuse to protect people, then people protect themselves. And that protection, when it comes, tends to be far more severe than what any court would have delivered. On September 15, 1946, 5 men murdered a 19-year-old boy because he was educated. Because he was going to college. Because he represented something that terrified them. The system called it suicide. By September 22, 1946, those 5 men were dead or destroyed. And 12 more KKK members were dead or gone. Was this justice? By legal standards, no. It was murder. It was arson. It was organized violence. But by the standards of a community that had been failed by every institution designed to protect it, it was the only justice available. It was the only response that mattered. It was the only language that the KKK could understand. Bumpy Johnson didn't become a legend because he was violent. He became a legend because he understood something fundamental about power in a world where institutions have failed. He understood that when the system won't protect you, you protect yourself. And when you protect yourself, you make sure that the threat is eliminated completely. You make sure that the message is clear. You make sure that no one ever tries the same thing again. Thomas Johnson was buried at Abyssinian Baptist Church on September 21, 1946. 3,000 people attended. The casket was closed. Ruth Johnson had insisted. She wanted people to remember Thomas alive. Smiling. Full of promise. Bumpy stood next to his sister throughout the service. His face showed nothing. But his eyes carried the weight of what he'd done and what he'd authorized. As the casket was lowered into the ground, Bumpy placed something on top. A photograph. Thomas in his Columbia sweatshirt holding a law book. Smiling. And 5 other photographs. Danny Morrison hanging. Rick Sullivan burned. Lou Bennett broken. Frank Dorsey homeless. The KKK warehouse burning. Underneath a note. Thomas, they paid. All of them. Every man who touched you. Every man who supported them. Harlem delivered justice. Rest easy, nephew. Your mother is safe. Your neighborhood is safe. Nobody will do this again. I promise. Uncle Bumpy. Ruth saw the photographs and the note. She put her hand on Bumpy's arm. Is it over? It's over, Bumpy said. Did they understand? Ruth asked. Bumpy looked at his sister. They understand. Harlem will make sure they understand. And they'll make sure that no one ever tries this again. September 15, 1946. A 19-year-old boy was lynched by the KKK in Harlem. The system called it suicide. September 22, 1946. The KKK in Harlem ceased to exist. What happened in between reveals something profound about justice when institutions fail. It reveals what happens when a community is forced to protect itself. It reveals the price that gets paid by those who target protected communities. It reveals that there are lines that, if you cross them, you don't just face the legal system. You face the community. And the community, when it decides to act, is far more comprehensive and far more devastating than any court could ever be. Thomas Johnson wanted to be a civil rights attorney. He wanted to fight injustice through law. Bumpy Johnson delivered justice through something older than law. And for the next 100 years, Harlem remained a place where the KKK never returned. Not because of police. Not because of federal law. But because everyone understood, if you come to Harlem to lynch our children, we will eliminate you. Completely. Permanently. Absolutely. That was the lesson. That was the message. That was the code that Bumpy Johnson established on September 15 to 22, 1946. And that code held for generations.